I'm Dr. Warren Doctor. I'm the president of the East Tennessee Historical Society. Welcome to the East Tennessee History Center. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. If you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, I would love for you to join. We have brochures, and you can write your name down to share your emails with us, so you can send our newsletters. And in our newsletters, we have our upcoming events, and I'll tell you about a few of them that we have coming up. On August 31st, we have an intermediate genealogy workshop, and we run those. That's at 1 p.m. Those are always very fun and informative if you're interested in your family history. On September 9th, we're starting a new program that we call the History Parlor, where people are invited at 9:30 in the morning to come and talk about any books that maybe they've been reading about history and to give a synopsis. We're sort of trying to start a kind of it's almost like a book club. Are we okay in the back? Oh, okay. And then on October 9th, we're going to be having a talk about the legacy of Wilma Dykeman, and it's called Of Words and Water with children's book authors Shannon Hitchcock and Jim Stokely. That will be at 5:30 p.m., so that will be like this, will be an evening lecture. And then also on October 11th, we're having our second annual Football Friday, which I'm very excited about. We bring in a Tennessee Vol history maker, and we sort of have a party with food trucks and stuff on that side of the museum. So it's a lot of fun. We're going to close down the street. We have a very good time. So if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, I'd love for you to join. Tonight, I'm really excited about tonight's talk, in part because Kate, Dr. Ballantyne, who will be speaking, reached out to me, I guess, back when it was still Twitter. Is that right? Yeah. And explained her project to me, and we were very excited to have her. I'm also excited to tell you that Kate's career trajectory looked something like mine up until recently, because you grew up in Oak Ridge. I grew up in Granger County. We both, at some point, found ourselves at Cambridge. I guess you're still there teaching in Liverpool at John Moore. I taught in Aberystwyth, which is sort of kind of in the same part of the world. And obviously I moved back so I could be a part of the East Tennessee Historical Society. But Kate has stayed in academia. She got her bachelor's in history and Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina. We won't hold that against her because I got mine at UT. And she did her MPhil and her PhD at the University of Cambridge. She was at Clare. I was at Clare. You were at Clare College. I was at the other Clare. But anyway, we must have missed each other by that much, which is kind of hilarious. But she's here tonight to talk about her book, which is recently published by the University of Georgia Press. It's called Radical Volunteers, Dissent, Desegregation, and Student Power in Tennessee. So I'd like everyone to give her a warm round of applause and a welcome. Thank you so much for coming, Kate. This is going to be fantastic.
Thank you all so much for coming out. And can I just say it's really nice to be somewhere where I can say y'all and not have to explain what I'm trying to say. I have to start each class with like, hi everyone, I'm Kate, and I say y'all, and I mean you all. And they kind of look at me really blankly, partly because I seem really old and partly because, y'all seems like a weird concept. So thank you all so much for coming out. I want to thank, in particular, the East Tennessee Historical Society for having me, especially Warren, Lisa, and Kelly for arranging everything. And as Warren said, I'm a historian of modern American history with an emphasis on civil rights, student activism, and free speech. And as he said, I grew up in Oak Ridge and became particularly interested in modern Southern history while I was studying at the University of South Carolina. And that's my 3-month-old. He's doing really well along with his big sister. So I was at the University of South Carolina for my undergrad, and I know I didn't study as a vol. But while working as an undergraduate assistant for an academic conference on Southern student activism, that was really my kind of introduction to the topic. And I kept wanting to come back and find out more about where I came from. So this really has been a story for me of kind of consistently finding episodes, first starting in Oak Ridge and then different episodes in Tennessee, and always kind of wanting to know more about who I am, without that sounding cliche, by finding out more about the history of Tennessee in my state. I'm here today in particular to introduce my first book, which came out with UGA Press in May. So, there are many different episodes of activism discussed in the book, but I want to start today's talk with one which took place here in Knoxville, partly because that's where we are, and partly because it epitomizes many of the major points about the book. So, Reverend Billy Graham, here on the top left with Nixon, Billy Graham decided to hold a week-long evangelical crusade in Knoxville, and specifically at the University of Tennessee, or UT, at the end of May 1970. The Crusade Organizing Committee chose the university campus for the large capacity Neyland Stadium offered. Many UT students and staff were frustrated by the news of the crusade using the football stadium during finals week. As we might imagine, anything that's kind of interrupting their studies and their final preparation for exams wasn't really welcome, much less having a really large event held at the stadium. And I'm told that people used to actually have dorms in the stadium, so I think that was kind of part of the issue as well, is that they really are having everything be very interrupted during that week. They also cited the need for separation of church and state, which I think is a fair point. So, many UT students and staff were frustrated by the news of this crusade, but it was the announcement that President Richard Nixon would be speaking during the crusade's youth night that sparked this particular protest. So, although Nixon's visit was only announced a day in advance, crusade organizers, university officials, and the White House moved forward with plans anticipating some form of protests, but expecting them to be small and unimpactful. On the night of May 28, 1970, tens of thousands of crusade attendees filed past local police and Secret Service agents to enter Neyland Stadium for that evening's events. Among those were a few hundred students and university staff who tucked signs stating "Thou shalt not kill" into their waistbands, hidden from law enforcement outside the stadium. The White House chose this moment for Nixon's visit to UT for two main reasons, and for them it's really quite strategic. As it was Nixon's first visit to a university campus after the damaging news of the US invasion of Cambodia and the galvanizing campus shootings at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970, they felt that the Knoxville crowd, particularly given the large number of evangelical crusade attendees who would be there, would be receptive and supportive of Nixon. They perceived the UT students to potentially protest a little bit, but they didn't think that they would really be very organized or really disrupt anything. And they were wrong to a point. The White House and Graham's Knoxville Crusade Committee believed the reception would be overwhelmingly positive, and that this would both boost Nixon's kind of overall national appearance and presence, but also give him a personal boost, because he really needed it at that point in his life, amid this kind of national discord surrounding his Vietnam policies. And I found that really interesting, that there's like this discussion around like boosting Nixon the man as well as Nixon's image in White House documents. White House staffer and native Tennessean William E. Timmons spoke with Tennessee Republican Congressman John Duncan a few days before the planned protest, with Timmons, the native Tennessean who worked in the White House, stating, quote, "I doubt that there would be any problem of Tennessee student demonstrations." But even Graham voiced concerns about the timing of this visit, suggesting that Nixon specifically not speak on Memorial Day, which was going to be May 25th, and that the tone of the visit be, quote, "going in for a church service, not to build a political rally out of it." And there's lots of discussions in documents about how they were going to do that. Were they going to sing any kind of political anthem? What political anthem might that be? If you weren't going to do an anthem, should you do a hymn instead? What would that look like? And I'm sure there's that kind of back and forth with most presidential events, but for this one in particular, I found that quite interesting. Graham felt that Nixon speaking on Youth Night in particular would give him the opportunity to speak directly to America's young people and to stress, in Graham's words, quote, the importance of religion to the moral fiber of the nation, and that the youth are the leaders of tomorrow and that their lives must be balanced. And part of that balancing is the acceptance and belief in religious values. So whatever the expectations or plans for the protests, a small yet vocal group of students and faculty protested Nixon inside Neyland Stadium on May 28, 1970. One UT student protester described the scene as, quote, 250 lions to 90,000 Christians. The protesters numbered between 300 and 500 and were outnumbered somewhere between 100 to 1 and 250 to 1 by crusade attendees. I have one of my former math teachers here, so that was the math. All right, so the differences in the estimations are partly due to whether or not the source took into account the crowd gathered outside Neyland Stadium. So you have a really, as I stated, kind of big number here, a number range. And I think because contemporary sources estimated between 55,000 to 100,000 people in attendance overall, I think they're taking into account those higher numbers, the people who were outside Neyland Stadium, which is also kind of an interesting way of looking at it. So they had protesters outside Neyland Stadium, and then they had these kind of hidden, quote unquote, protesters who entered the stadium and then brought out their signs once they were seated. Nixon's dissenters, while vastly outnumbered, were loud and were actually picked up in official recordings of the event, which I found really fascinating. Their heckles and chants, including 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want you anymore, interrupted Nixon several times during his speech. During a May 1970 news segment for ABC News, Charles Murphy concluded his report on Nixon speaking at the Knoxville Crusade with a final word, not about the event or its religious attendees, but about the protesters assembled there. The anti-war demonstrators were a small minority, Murphy stated, but the fact that they were even here on a conservative campus in a conservative state illustrates the deep division even here. And there are a few things that Murphy gets right here, I'd argue, namely the relatively small numbers compared to other national protests featured quite prominently in Tennessee protests. And that really kind of makes it more of kind of a hidden history in my argument. And Murphy's correct that there is an important regional socio-political dynamic to what activism occurred and how it presented. But, and here's where I come in, I think, he's overlooked that the Graham-Nixon protest came at the end of a particularly tense academic year at UT, not to mention across the state. At UT, the campus saw the administration building surrounded by student protesters in January 1970 over frustrations of the new university president. And student strikes against classes following Kent State earlier in May had significantly disrupted university business across the state. The book looks into the longer history of student activism that the Graham-Nixon protests built on, and asserts that Tennessee student activism is more of a national story than it is a regional one. Even just here in Knoxville, there was a strong sit-in movement that was led confidently by UT students Robert Booker and Avon Rollins, who later led the local Beck Center and were prominent activists in their later years. And student activism didn't stop there. The 1960s saw significant campus reform efforts from campuses in and around Knoxville, including, and this is a long list, but including UT, Knoxville College, Maryville College, Sewanee, the University of the South, Tusculum College, Morristown College, and Tennessee Wesleyan. Students would successfully protest limitations on campus speaker invitations at UT that culminated in a state Supreme Court in the late 1960s. And while the anti-war activism present in East Tennessee was not as pronounced as elsewhere in the country, given the prevailing support for the military and social conservatism of the region, the numbers of students and community members present at anti-war rallies is notable. So the book examines the centrality of the concept of student power within student activism in Tennessee across much of the 20th century. Let's try and stay in front of the microphone. I'm used to kind of walking around. Student power, as defined by contemporary sources, encompassed personal and political autonomy of students. It was a way of them finding a way to say, like, we want to have more power for our presence on campus and our time on campus. And it's really quite, I love the phrase student power. For me as a historian, student power was a great way of tracking all of these different protests that seem quite isolated and quite small on these different campuses throughout the 1950s and 1960s into the 1970s. And the fact that all of these protests centered around, in one way or another, the concept of this personal or political autonomy for students, I think, is really important. So students were kind of across the state less focused on external issues, namely the civil rights movement, kind of more broadly speaking. For their local community, they were particularly interested in civil rights, but kind of the national movement wasn't as prominent in documents, as well as the anti-war movement. And they were more focused on local issues that affected them. So campus and community inequality, student rights, and especially in loco parentis policy reforms. So in loco parentis, which is Latin for in place of a parent, encompassed university policies pertaining to a whole host of kind of students' lives on campus, including dress, dormitory visitation hours, chapel attendance where it was relevant, usually on the smaller religious campuses, and invitations of speakers to campus. And the book, and here's where I'm gonna make sure I'm still heard by the microphone. The book, I'm looking at 22 institutions. And it was really important to me to try and find campuses where protests happened. So that's actually where the choice was for these different campuses. I didn't just go, I'd like to look at Lemoyne Owen College and select that. For example, I found different protests on these different campuses first. But there are a whole host of different types of campuses and universities. So they include historically Black and predominantly white campuses, private and public ones, as well as large and small. And I think that really kind of builds this argument about student power and that kind of relevance of it. So the book makes 3 significant contributions. Yeah, I really love these photos too. Sorry, I'm seeing some faces. I love these. All right, so the first major contribution, I'd argue, is that the narrative of Tennessee student protest is the story of student activism in much of America during the 20th century. Now, if you'll allow me as a historian, I have to get a little bit of historiography in. So the historian Todd Gitlin, who was also a New Left and 1960 student protester himself, described influentially the New Left, or the youth-driven activism of the 1960s, as, quote, years of hope, days of rage. And this doesn't actually fit what happens in Tennessee. So this idea of years of hope, days of rage had defined historical study about the 1960s for years. In the last several years, we've really been contending with it in research. And looking at Tennessee and southern campuses in particular is a really great way, I'd argue, of kind of pushing back against that. So what he means is that Gitlin's argument is that the years of hope were the early days or early years of the decade. So from 1960 with the sit-ins to the emergence of Black power, he argues, and the intensification of the Vietnam War activism in 1968. So you have that kind of years of hope, this kind of long, hopeful, in his mind, optimistic era. Days of Rage, for him, referred to the end of the decade between 1968 and 1969, where he, as a former activist, saw the New Left's idealism and optimism fall apart. This narrative has been widely critiqued by historians in recent years, as I mentioned. But it's important to mention here because part of what makes studying the South, and Tennessee specifically, so important is how the growth and development of activism looked. So because it looks very different, it's really important to kind of think about how it fits in on a wider scale. Student movements both grew and fractured more slowly in Tennessee. Activism dates back to as early as the 1920s. And despite the crushing effect of McCarthyism and anti-communist fears of the 1940s and 1950s, New Left activists fostered intergenerational connections based on students' focus on personal autonomy and social welfare with activists from the 1930s, known as the Old Left. The second major point of the book is that interracial student activism was evident prior to the February 1960 sit-ins, dating to collegiate student exchanges and workshops from 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was passed by the Supreme Court, declaring segregated education unequal. And that's happening in Tennessee. That's not happening necessarily elsewhere in the country. White and black students fought for similar causes focused on student life on campuses and community improvement. And this interracial organizing only begins to show some cracks around 1968, rather than and opposed to previous studies on national activism that emphasized the kind of middle of the decade, around 1964 or 1965. And it reaches its peak in Tennessee in spring 1970 with the reactions to Kent State as described at the beginning of the presentation with the Graham-Nixon protest in particular. The final point is that as the first statewide study of student activism to look at both black and white students together, and one of a growing historiography on Southern student activism, the book also straddles the fields of civil rights and New Left studies. And the choice of Tennessee here was important, not just for me personally. The three regions that all of us seated here are really quite well-versed in, right? The three geographical regions of the state give us as historians and scholars three different connections to different areas of the South, right? West Tennessee is more like the Deep South, Middle and East Tennessee are more representative of the Border South or the Upper South, right? And for this study in particular, if you're going to look at a statewide study, you want it to actually encompass and say something about the region ideally. And so I think that's part of why Tennessee just fits so great in the sense is those three geographical regions. Taken together, the study's able to examine elements of the state's activism that are representative of the whole region, as well as shed light on elements that aren't necessarily Southern, quote unquote. But as we're in East Tennessee today, I'm sure this region's history is of particular interest, especially since we're at ETHS. Campuses and students from this part of the state feature throughout the book, and I want to kind of touch on a few particular moments and then open it up for discussion. So first off, the spring 1930 student strike at Lincoln Memorial University began over perceived lack of student autonomy and involved the vast majority of the campus's student body. While it was ultimately crushed by the administration, it demonstrated, according to the Knoxville News Sentinel at the time, quote, a truer sense of Lincolnian ideals of justice, democracy, and the worth of the individual than the administration which was charged with the responsibility for inculcating them. This next group, if anyone happens to know anything about this group, please catch me after this talk. The Brotherhood, which was a group of Christian Sunday school attendees, turned politically and socially aware young people in Summerfield, located in Grundy County, so near Sewanee, in the latter years of the Great Depression, were particularly more religious and not college students, but they had this really fascinating to me biracial welfare-focused agenda that I think is quite notable for the late 1930s and for a place that's so isolated at the time. And these kind of welfare-focused initiatives for Black and white citizens of America would later be echoed by New Left activists in the 1960s and 1970s. So kind of move into the kind of period of 1950s and 1960s. Fisk, I know in Middle Tennessee, but Fisk and then later Sewanee ran interracial college exchange programs in the 1960s. And Fisk I need to mention here because they actually ran them from the 1950s, and that's really quite extraordinary. Student participants, including Candy Carowin of just outside Highlander, would go on to participate in the sit-ins, and the programs are notable for the significant resistance that they faced. Highlander Folk School ran college weekend workshops for students from across the country in the 1950s, and once the sit-ins began in 1960, they quickly pivoted their focus to include sit-in demonstrators in their regular workshops, recognizing that student activists really had a place in the movement. And in doing so, they provided student activists with invaluable resources and connections. And the photograph here from the cover of the book is actually from 1959 from one of these college workshops. Knoxville's sit-ins, as I mentioned really briefly at the beginning of the talk, were run by Robert Booker and later Avon Rollins here in Knoxville, and involved students from UT and Knoxville College. While Nashville's sit-ins are the ones that are internationally known, the city's student activists here in Knoxville had really great success in desegregating businesses on their own. And I don't think that we should, as a community, kind of disregard that history at all. So I'm hopeful that, like, through the book, I'm able to kind of give it one more little push. And lastly, notable 1960s political icons spoke throughout Tennessee during the period, encouraging students to be active in their campuses and communities. In Knoxville, famed civil rights activist and lawyer William Kunstler of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, history and fame, spoke in Circle Park in May 1970. While his speech was inspiring, it's one of the letters to the editor of the News Sentinel that I find particularly funny and kind of wanted to end on here. The Knoxvillian who was writing in argued that Kunstler's speech should take place in the city dump because, he says, quote, "It shouldn't be too hard to provide him with a soapbox. But if it did have to take place at Tennessee, or at UT, the campus, quote, should be fully fumigated following the long hair and hand-waving affair." So we do have some references there. So I want to end there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll open it up to discussion and questions. Thanks. Mr. Evans.
Well, thank you for speaking. Your discussion on activism seems to be centered on activism at universities. Mm-hmm. There are other places where a significant amount of activism was promoted, and like in the Black Church, mm-hmm. or other civic organizations. And did your studies kind of delve into this, or what sort of interplay or collaboration
was there?
You can repeat or summarize what the question is before your answer, just so we capture it for the folks watching at home.
Sure, thanks. Okay, so in terms of the book does look at campus student activism, because campuses are oftentimes where college students get together and protest, or at least think and discuss ideas. But the question was, does the book also look at community activism, right? And in particular, what about churches and what about community centers? Absolutely it does. And part of my argument, it works. I feel like I'm still kind of coming out of that PhD fog where you're like defending your thesis for so long that you still feel like you need to defend it. Part of my thesis, and what ended up in the book, is that if you're going to look at this, it's not a hidden history, but something that I didn't grow up knowing. I'll say that. I know there are a number of people here who are actually personally connected to the activism that I talk about in the book. So I don't want to deprivilege that. But I didn't grow up learning this, and this is where I was kind of really interested in finding out more. If you're trying to find that kind of history, I think you need to think outside the box about where that activism might have happened and also what that looked like. So for me, college workshops at Highland or Folk School were just as important as campus protests and demonstrations. And community discussions and meetings at local churches, black and white. For Tennessee, there were a number of really prominent, or Knoxville, there were a number of prominent black churches that were involved in the sit-ins in particular. But Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church was also really important in getting people both organized as well as moving forward with the demonstrations. So it's those kind of participants that I think are really important, and what I felt was a really important inclusion in the book. So yeah, they have an important place. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, sir.
Okay, do you have any idea what the geographic composition of the student protesters were? I mean, my experience is a lot of people were from out of state.
So it's a really good question. I think in terms of looking at what the geographical composition was of the different student protesters, I've read a number of really good studies that were able to focus on one university over a number of years, and that gave them, I think, a little bit better of a sense of what that student body looked like and how it changed. It's one of the things that I think if I'd had even more time and even more resources, I might have been able to look into a little bit more for the book, and one of those things that I'd like to look at more for my next research project, actually. So it's a really valid point. In terms of Tennessee in particular, it changes during the 1950s and early 1960s. A lot of the students who were active were actually local Tennesseans, but that depended on which campus you were talking about. So a lot of private institutions would have students coming from out of state, and so you'd have more out of state students present and active at places like Fisk or Sewanee, as opposed to the more state local campuses had more local students. That starts to change into the 1960s, but that trend is still kind of the same. In terms of the actual student numbers, it's really difficult to get a sense of it. Sometimes you're able to get an account from usually a student newspaper of how many people were present at a protest, but even that isn't super accurate, and it's not representative of that question that you have, which is a really good one. But it would entail, I think, interviewing as many people at each campus as possible, I think. Yes, sir, I had one in the back first.
Congratulations on your publication of your book, really exciting research. I have a question about, it seems like you're beginning in the 1930s through the 1970s, and obviously the issues that students are dealing with evolve and they're very different. But what are some of the, since you're dealing with all these institutions, 22 institutions, what are some of the core issues or themes that you're able to sort of discuss as a kind of through line throughout the book? Mm-hmm. And also, I'm particularly interested in North Carolina and I'm familiar with the 1960s, 1969 student takeover at Duke University and so forth. Were there any instances, I would imagine Memphis State probably, but yeah. Could you speak a little bit about some of those central issues that students, that you sort of write about throughout the entirety of the book?
Sure, yeah. That's a fascinating question. So in terms of kind of thinking about what the through line of the book is and what those kind of major protests are that students are protesting from those 1930s protests through the 1970s, it largely comes down to that concept of student power, which for me is that kind of umbrella term, which works for covering any kind of personal or political autonomy that students are fighting for. It does mean that you have to be a little bit creative with that terminology when you're talking about, as you mentioned, Memphis State University, when you're talking about the reaction that campuses had in Memphis to Martin Luther King's assassination. Those protests weren't strictly about personal or political autonomy of students, right? But they're still, really interestingly, they're still talking about student power and defining student power and describing student power in those protests. But they're doing it in terms of like this, the university isn't responding to their concerns about, for example, Martin Luther King's assassination, as they think they should be. And so for them, that's an infringement on their kind of role and place at the university. Does that make sense? So I think the kind of very early protests, the first one in the book is 1925 at Fisk. And that was a really interesting one. W.E.B. Du Bois's daughter was graduating from Fisk in 1924. And he gives a speech at the graduation ceremony about kind of rising up and thinking about their own autonomy. And about how they're not just automatons who are graduating from this campus, but instead people who have the power to be able to change society, and that all starts on the campus. It's fascinating. And Du Bois, I think, kind of kickstarts this idea so that the next year, the next academic year, students are really thinking about that. They had a very authoritarian university president on the campus at the time. And students start very quickly protesting, but protesting in loco parentis policies. So they start kind of protesting the dress that they're having to wear, the chapel hours that they're having to go for, library hours, that kind of thing. But it's all centered on their own power. And that all just kind of keeps building, I'd argue, through the 1950s and 1960s. Thanks. Yes, sir. I love your shirt, by the way.
The whole idea that it was foreigners that were doing this is not true at all. Like the Knoxville 22, the people that, that were arrested at the demonstrations, the Billy Graham Nixon demonstrations. Gus Haydorn from Sweetwater, Tennessee, was probably the most prominent of the leaders of the Knoxville 22 that had been involved in student protests. The reason they were the ones arrested was they had been involved in the administration building protests before they got involved at the stadium. And the people in the Southern Student Organizing Committee, et cetera, it wasn't a bunch of foreigners that came into Tennessee and were, you know, the only ones that were doing things. It was Tennesseans that were involved in all of this.
Yeah. So Tennesseans have always been involved in a lot of political organizing and political activism, and not just dated to Highlander Folk School. And I think as Tennesseans, we have a lot to be proud of with that history.
Miles is from Savannah, Tennessee.
And Miles is from Savannah, Tennessee. Yes.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Very true. And I think, at least for me with writing the book, I kept wanting to know more. I've got some family members here, but I grew up in a really politically aware family that was really focused on and kind of built into the fabric of kind of Anderson County local politics. And we talked about history all the time, but we didn't talk about anything related to student activism. And when it would touch on that, it was kind of like what happened in 1968, in Columbia, or what happened in 1964 in Berkeley, and that really got the ball rolling with me once I got into history classes and then started studying it more concretely about like, well, what's the Tennessee history here in terms of the 1960s? And so I hope that this book is kind of one of hopefully several books from other people too, talking about different aspects of this history and throughout the South, because I think we can learn a lot by comparing Tennessee with other southern states in that regard.
Well, as you know, Anderson County in the 50s was very active with the integration of the Oak Ridge swimming pool and then the integration of the Clinton school system. And this all took place, I guess, in the 50s. Were student activists involved in that at all? That's my question.
Yeah, so were student activists involved in the kind of desegregation, Clinton 12?
Integration of the swimming pool.
They were. They
I got
were.
one other question.
Yeah.
Do your students know what unsweet tea is?
Do my students know what unsweet tea is? No. I can talk more about that. I think moving to England and living in England has made me identify more as a Southerner. It's a weird, for me, kind of weird outreach of that, because I'm having to kind of talk about y'all as well as like why biscuits are really awesome. And no, we're not talking about the, the shortbread biscuits, right? We're talking about the proper fluffy biscuits. It's little things like that that I think, like, for me, it's like such an identity connection that, again, they don't know about unsweet tea. Tea for them wouldn't be iced and it would be hot. And my mother-in-law would insist on having, hot tea all the time, no matter what the temperature is, right? So like unsweet tea is like a step, several steps further away. Yeah, yeah, much less iced tea. Yeah.
I was just kind of curious about if there was any rebellion like between students. I know currently as a student at the University of Tennessee that when there's protests there's kind of a lot of headbutting forces, so I imagine it was similar, but I was wondering if you'd heard about any particular instances.
Yeah. Oh, I was really hoping somebody from UT would come. Thanks. Okay, so are there kind of episodes of students kind of protesting against each other or at least disagreeing about issues? Absolutely. At UT specifically, the Young Americans for Freedom or the YAF, which I know is still around today, I think. Don't quote me on that. But the YAF in particular was really prominent from like the mid-1960s through the 1970s on campus. They tend to be the most kind of outspoken group at UT in terms of thinking about what the conservative student body should look like or like conservative political values should look like. But even within a student body, whether or not you're looking at a state university or a more smaller private one, for example, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. And even within one organization where people are kind of focused on one or two kind of main ideas, there's still a lot of disagreement around that. What I think tends to historically work best is if people have some kind of format of being able to hear each other. It doesn't have to necessarily be a Robert's Rules of Order kind of situation, but if you're actually able to kind of listen to each other and then have maybe a smaller committee kind of reflect on that and kind of think about what the design and kind of drive will be for the organization moving forward based on that conversation or those conversations that they're having. I think the kind of completely decentralized conversations tended to not work as well. And maybe that's kind of those episodes of where that kind of conflict kind of comes in the most. Does that answer your question? It's a really good one. Yeah.
Hey, my question is about the arc of hope that you were speaking about earlier, and how it seemed to decline towards the end of the 60s. Do you think the decline of that had to do with or maybe, I don't know if there's any relevance to this or not, but did the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, did that take some of the air out of the power movement of the students, do you think, or could that be related to it?
It did. So when you're thinking of that Gitlin quote about the years of hope, days of rage, did the years of hope kind of decline in his argument around 1960 based on the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King? Yes. And I think what we've found as historians in the last 10, 15 years, based on that kind of idea that's been so prevalent in the scholarship so far, is that those ideas around the years of hope really works if you think about everything on a national level. National organizations were really impacted by the 1968 riots and by 1968 DNC protest and by the very notable King and Kennedy assassinations in 1968, not to mention the whole host of other things that have been happening around then. But that narrative doesn't fit as well when you look on a state or a regional level. And that's my main argument, is that national story, those organizations do kind of rise and fall kind of around that time. but at least Tennessee's and as well as like other areas of the South, there's a longer buildup of that activism that contradicts that. So we're only really hitting our stride as Tennessee activists by like 1968, 1969, rather than actually falling. So, yeah, thanks. Lisa. Okay. Yes, sir.
You looked at student activism for about 50 years, from 1920, 1970s, and you nationally and focused on Tennessee, and you say the activities in Tennessee were comparable to those in the nation. That makes you kind of an expert on activism. So if you're going to write a primer on student activism and what works, what's effective, so and so that students today could, as John Lewis would have put it, make good trouble, what would you tell them to do?
What should student activists do today to make good trouble? In John Lewis's words, yeah?
Sometimes it's done well or poorly or effectively. You know, if the goal is to achieve an end,
Yeah.
how do you do it?
All right, so here's the deal. Speaking personally, as well as my professional background, I think what we're going to see, don't quote me on this, but I think what we're going to see this next coming academic year is going to be a resurgence of those student protests that were happening in May. I think students are going to reorganize, and I think they're going to figure out another way to demonstrate. We're already seeing that in the last week in Michigan. And I think that's going to come back to Tennessee. In terms of what works, and I'm going to talk right to the camera here in the hopes that someone is listening, organize, think about your message, and talk with other people. Talk with community leaders. Don't just speak to people on campus. Don't just speak to other students. Get the word out and talk to people in the local community. I think if you do that, you're going to both, at least hopefully, get your message projected a little bit further than you otherwise would. And I think you're going to have people coming to support you. But I don't think it hurts to kind of get that message centralized. And in order to do that, it really helps to have those conversations with community members. So that's what I do. Yes, Lisa.
So I do have a question. As a teacher here with young people that come to the museum, and I'm sure you're the same way, you'd like to know what do people have prior knowledge of? And so for the civil rights movement and for the sit-ins, a lot of folks know about Nashville, and you mentioned Nashville. Nashville has its own reputation nationally as, kind of a benchmark. So how do you then build off of that to bring it back to what your argument is, if you're starting from people's knowledge of Nashville sit-ins with the prominent characters that were, and prominent leaders that were involved in that?
Yeah, thanks. So where do we start if we're thinking about what most people know, which is the Nashville sit-ins, and kind of broadening that knowledge base out to talk about the rest of the state? I'll say the chapter on sit-ins was actually the most difficult for me to write for that reason, because Nashville is also what I know best, not because I lived there, but because my master's dissertation was on Nashville student activism as a way of looking at, so we have the sit-ins, but what else happened, right? And trying to contextualize the sit-ins during a wider period of time or a longer period of time. I think my main argument is that while there's kind of local color, if you want to say, between what happens in Memphis and Chattanooga and Knoxville, compared to Nashville, I think the argument is that actually it's really quite similar to what happens in Nashville. We just didn't have the massive publicity that Nashville did for a number of really important reasons, right? And there are a number of really key leaders who then go out as part of the Nashville diaspora to go to other local communities and study there, and teach other people how to be active. So what I'm trying to do is not deprivilege Nashville at all. That's a really important history. But I think what we want to think about as well as Tennesseans is thinking about how Memphis's history has a really important role. Memphis sit-ins were a little bit later than Nashville's, and as part of kind of the effort from the white public to try and kind of resolve everything quite quickly in Memphis, things actually got resolved quite quickly. And similarly with Knoxville. Knoxville leaders didn't want to have long drawn-out sit-ins and major protests around things. So while there were kind of two movements led by Robert Booker first and then Avon Rollins, the students were able to actually organize and meet with white businessmen and women. I'm sorry, it was an interracial group of businessmen in Knoxville, but you know, they're really trying to organize things and get things kind of pushed through quite quickly. And that is pretty similar to what's happening in Nashville. So it's more of a story, I think, of continuity and similarity than it is kind of change or difference in that one instance. Thanks. Yes, sir.
So the civil rights movement was making progress. Then we had the war protests. What was the effect of the war protests on dampening the civil rights movement, if there was one?
I think nationally we see a dampening of that. I teach a movement, or a module, on the civil rights movement, and we have a week where I try and introduce students to the idea of where the anti-war movement fits in, and what its impact was on the civil rights movement more broadly. In Tennessee, I think it actually intensifies the protests. I think students more readily start to kind of both look at the newspapers as well as kind of talk with each other about how there are different protests possible and different meetings and events going on. So rather than it actually kind of fracturing the movement per se, they're actually kind of intensifying those numbers. That is to say, the caveat there is that for white student protesters and black student protesters across the state, and there are slight variations there depending on where you're looking at different times, but the black and white student protesters had been working together for quite a long period of time. And then around 1968, they start to kind of fracture, and fracture is probably not the best word because it wasn't a contentious break. They just started kind of moving in their own directions, or different directions. But that's not to say that black student protesters and white student protesters weren't still organizing around, say, the Graham-Nixon protest. But I think in terms of thinking about how Vietnam impacted the civil rights movement, when we look at Tennessee in particular, it had a contribution to that division because more white students and more black students had kind of differing ideas about where those ideas around power should go and what that solution should be. Does that answer your question? Which was a good one. Yes, sir.
I think the biggest impact of the war in Vietnam on the civil rights movement was that it was the month before Dr. King got assassinated in '68 in March was when he had the meeting in Atlanta to organize the first Poor People's Campaign. And so there was hope for the civil rights movement to evolve in the direction of a multiracial, interracial movement of the poor. And then when the Vietnam War happened, the movement was affected by the drafting of people that had been involved or were likely to become involved, and also people getting more involved in the anti-war movement and less involved in thinking about what's the future of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've got a good point. I think in terms of kind of thinking about why people are joining different protests in the late 1960s, I think the immediacy that people might be drafted, and particularly when we're thinking about college students, I think we shouldn't deprivilege that or unprivilege that, absolutely. And that certainly does motivate a lot of people across the state, both black and white, in terms of what those student protest numbers look like. Yes.
You don't have to answer this question, but I wanted to flip his question in terms of the importance of the civil rights movement's influence on the anti-war protests. Right? Part of that fracturing has to do with the civil rights the students who were working with the civil rights movement, branching off into different areas, Black Power movement, right, the continued student left movement, and so forth. But that's important to kind of flip that question. The civil rights movement had as much of an impact on anti-war protests as kind of movement talk.
It
Yeah,
did,
because we
yeah.
knew that the government was lying. You know, we learned that in the civil rights movement. And so then when there was this war, we thought, oh, those liars are now doing this monkey business.
But you're absolutely right, sir. We want to think about not just what the impact of the Vietnam War was on the civil rights movement, but flipping, you're absolutely right. And I think it's really important too to kind of think about I'm a historian of like the long civil rights movement, so I'm definitely on board in terms of thinking about kind of how does that long Black freedom struggle look, and what are the kind of slight blips or interruptions here and there based on other issues that are kind of hitting them. But in terms of thinking about why people protest the way that they do, you're absolutely right. I think too much of the narrative is kind of on Vietnam and not as much on the civil rights movement, or kind of like why is the civil rights movement fracture when instead it's also the Vietnam War movement fracturing too, if that makes sense. And there's a lot more interaction there, you're right.
In fairness, that was the time that the government decided to get rid of most deferments, and every college student, every male college student was faced with Vietnam.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I felt, and I was, again, reading things from abroad, but based on kind of the May 1970, I just said it, May 1970, May 2024 protests, I felt like a lot of the time there wasn't as much focus on kind of why are students protesting from a personal standpoint, I guess. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. It's not just these kind of external forces that they're aware of and they just decide like, I'm just gonna protest that. I'm completely in agreement that the external forces are important, but I'm trying to say I think there's a lot to be said for like the personal commitment that people have to their activism. And I hope that this book does a little bit to kind of contribute to that point, because you're absolutely right. The deferments and that kind of immediacy for people of not just is the Vietnam War a kind of concern, a huge one, but a concern, but it's now like an actual threat for me as a UT student, say. You're absolutely right. It was a really important point.
I got that too. It seemed like the narrative was on the external forces and that the students were almost pawns. Now, in May 2024, that these students were sort of pawns of this whole conservative versus liberal and the Palestinian, Israel versus Palestinian, and sort of made political, it seemed like they were being made into political pawns, and there wasn't, you're right, we didn't see anything about that here either.
And I think,
about, well, what were the students worried about? What were they thinking about?
and I think in terms of connections between May 1970 and May 2024, I guess, as a historian of Southern activism and student activism specifically, I see a lot of connections between like protests intensifying in May of an academic year. There are a lot of reasons for that. But I think what I hope is that the book is doing a little bit to contribute to the idea of kind of looking at why students protest in the ways that they do. And specifically because I'm looking at Tennessee, where archivist after archivist told me that there wasn't any student activism on their campus and looked at me really sympathetically and were like, really sorry you've made this whole trip over from England, but like we didn't have any kind of protest here. And, after looking through archives for a few days, you'd find terms that the university would use for like unrest or dissent or in loco parentis issues, where those protests were there, but we just don't have an institutional memory or even kind of wider regional memory of those protests. And I guess that's all I mean is like by kind of thinking about the more current protests too, I don't want to just seem like someone who's talking about these series of events in the 1960s and 1970s and saying like that's an isolated period. I think there's a lot to be learned from that period about what's going on today, as much as like the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s, right? So I think student activists in general should probably be more, more thought, kind of more strongly about, because they're really thinking these ideas through. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for having me.